As we look at one area that can help us understand the reliability and trustworthiness of the Bible, we want to talk about a little bit some of the important aspects of archaeology in the Bible and realize that, first of all, it's somewhat of a controversial topic. The backgrounds and beliefs of those who are doing this work do influence their work, and it's an ever-changing field and new discoveries are being made quite frequently. As far as it being a controversial topic, there have been recently many who question much of the work done in past generations. And there's a big debate between the minimalist and the maximalist, those who minimize any real relationship between what's found in these sites and the Bible, and those who might maybe go beyond what sometimes the evidence might warrant. And also, there is sometimes a challenge between conservatives and liberals on how they interpret Scripture and how they apply some of the finds of archaeology. And also, we're dealing with an ever-changing field. New discoveries are being made which help us re-examine and look again at evidence that frequently is being brought to light. There are some observations I think that we ought to look at as well. First of all, there are hundreds and perhaps thousands of sites throughout the ancient Near East. Many of these sites have not been excavated at all, and some of the sites that have been excavated, only a small percentage of those sites have been unearthed. And many sites, it's impossible to excavate because of money or manpower or location. Many modern cities are built over ancient sites. Much of the dating for many of these sites is based upon pottery, and sometimes that can be somewhat indefinite as well. And sometimes the remains may not tell the whole story of what that civilization was really like. So we all need to be aware of the limitations of archaeology. For Bible students, we live in exciting times. In the last 150 years or so, many great discoveries have come to light that help confirm and support the reliability and authenticity of the Bible. Archaeology is a field that helps us dig into the past, bring up things that can help illuminate times and places that the Bible talks about. It wasn't too long ago where many people were very critical of the Bible, saying that Moses could not have written the first several books of the Bible because he didn't know how to write. There was no language or no ability to do so. However, recently, in the past 100 years or so, many discoveries have shown that writing was widespread. For example, in 1974, at Ebla in Syria, there was found a stash of very large number of clay tablets. Over 1,757 were found with writing that chronicled things of great interest to the people there. There were over 1,000 place names and administrative records that were recorded. And it shows how early writing was and much about the ancient culture. Also, the Mari tablets, dating from around 1800 BC, were found near Tel Harari in Syria in 1933. A palace was found there, a ziggurat, and an archive of over 23,000 cuneiform tablets. Some of these tablets contain parallels with traditions and treaties and customs of the Bible. In fact, treaty documents with Hammurabi and Zimri Lim were also found at Mari. The Mari tablets show that many of the biblical customs are echoed in the customs of the contemporaneous culture. For example, Abraham takes Hagar, the handmaiden of Sarah, when Sarah was barren. And even though Ishmael was born to Hagar, later Isaac supplants Ishmael's inheritance. Second, Laban also consults his sister Rebekah when she marries Isaac. But when his daughters are married, they are not consulted. Again, paralleling local customs. In Genesis 38, Judah and Tamar, the brother must marry his sister-in-law if her husband dies. And this also is a local custom found in the Mari tablets. And lastly, Joseph's brothers were afraid that Benjamin would get the inheritance, even though he is the younger. These are, among others, some of the similarities between the biblical customs and the parallel customs in the culture of the time. And then the Nuzi tablets from around 1500 years before Christ. 20,000 Akkadian cuneiform tablets were found near Ashur in Iraq in 1925. Again, showing how life was then and certain administrative practices, as well as things, how life was during the time of the patriarchs. The Boghoscoi Tablets, also from around 1500 years before Christ, were discovered in 1906 in northeast Turkey. There were 30,000 clay tablets found at Hattusis, the capital of the Hittite Empire. Up until that time, there were many skeptics and critics who even doubted that the Hittite Empire ever existed. And now we have these 30,000 clay tablets from the library at Hattusa. It shows the Hittite culture and its widespread interaction with its neighbors. And of course, the Hittites are mentioned often in Scripture in the Old Testament. And then as we come to Israel in the 10th century, around 1,000 years before Jesus, we find the Gezer calendar, discovered in 1908, just 20 miles west of Jerusalem. It's in Paleo, Hebrew, or Phoenician, and it's an account of the agricultural cycles during that time in the history of Israel. Also from Egypt, we have the Meremtop stele. Pharaoh Meremtop from Egypt made several excursions and conquests. This is from 1230 BC, and it mentions his conquest and excursions into Israel. In fact, this is the earliest extra-biblical reference to Israel, and it reads, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is not." Also, a Pharaoh mentioned often in Scripture in the Old Testament is Shishak. He ruled Egypt from 945 to 924 BC. He invaded Israel in 925 BC, and on the temple at Karnak is recorded this invasion. 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 1 through 12 mentions this invasion. And on the relief, many cities that are in Israel, Arad, Beth Horon, Bethshean, Gibeon, and several others, Megiddo, are mentioned on this inscription. This was discovered by Jean Champollion in 1828. Then in Israel also we have found a community just recently in the year 2007. Kirbet Kayafa is only 27 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It's in the valley of Elah. This is where David and Goliath had their battle. It was been questioned recently if David was really a king. Some were saying that it was merely a made-up story and that there really wasn't organized communities around Israel during the time of David. But this discovery shows, in fact, that there were communities around 1,000 years before Christ. And this one was quite fortified. The pottery is from the 11th or 10th century BC. It is, so far, the only known fortified city in Judah during the time of David, but it does show that his kingdom was organized and that cities were around like this, a fortress city. In fact, this Kirbet Kiafa has 4-meter wide casemate walls, which seem to be somewhat indicative of the Israelite building of their walls. And there are 2 4-chambered gates on the south and west side of the city. There's an altar found there with evidence of sacrificial activity. And the interesting thing is there's no human figurines and no pig bones, both indicating Jewish type worship, which didn't allow statues and of course didn't eat pig. Also, there's an ostracon discovered here in 2008, which dates to 1,000 years before Christ. An ostracon is pottery with writing on it. It's in an early Hebrew script, and it's very early part of writing, one of the earliest Hebrew writings we have found to date. Kitab Hinnom is a site near Jerusalem, discovered in 1979. We found some inscriptions here on some very small silver scrolls, which record the earliest Bible verse and the earliest mention of Yahweh, dating back to around 600 BC. This is the oldest biblical scripture that's yet been found, and shows that writing was in existence at this time, and that the worship of Yahweh was known as well. And then we have also an even older inscription, the Pomegranate Inscription. Apparently the head of the scepter of King Solomon's temple. It's the only surviving relic of King Solomon's temple. It was discovered in 1979 and came to light through the antiquities market. And it reads, belonging to the temple of Yahweh, holy to the priest. This would be the oldest, then next to the silver amulets also. There is some debate about its authenticity. There's also an Aztec inscription from 705 to 681, discovered in 1903, and it describes the Assyrian attack of Azekah, and it mentions King Hezekiah, and it parallels the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 18-19 and 2 Chronicles chapter 32. There's also the Jehoash inscription of 800 BC, discovered in 2003. Talks about Jehoash making repairs to the temple. This is recorded also in the Bible, 2 Kings chapter 12. And then we have what's called the House of David inscription, found at Tel Dan in the northeast part of Israel. In the 9th century BC, this comes from Tel Dan and is in the Aramaic Paleo-Hebraic script, and it talks about the foreign king's victory over the king of Israel and the house of David. It's the first inscription with David's name found outside the Bible. Also, other kings mentioned in the Bible, Ben-Hadad, Hazael, Joram, Ahab, and Azariah. Jehoram and Jehu are mentioned. Very important inscription found at the high place in Dan from the 9th century BC. In 930 BC, when Solomon dies, his kingdom is divided. Jeroboam gets the northern 10 tribes, and one of the things he did was built shrines at Dan and Bethel. This is a high place at Dan that Jeroboam built so Israel would not go south to Jerusalem to worship. A little later, we find the Moabite Stone from Mesha, king of Moab, who ruled around 850 years BC. On this inscription, Omri and several cities of Israel are mentioned. Similar ideas and records are mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 4 through 27, the biblical account. Now in the Louvre in Paris. And the phrase House of David is also discovered on line 31 of the Moabite Stone. The Ekron inscription from 705 or 701 was discovered in 1996 and mentions several kings mentioned in the Bible: Ekron, King Achish, and King Padi. 1 Samuel 21 and 1 Kings 2 and 2 Kings 18 all mention these incidents. The seal of Shema from 782 to 745 was discovered in 1904. And it has King Jeroboam II's inscription on it. 1 Kings chapter 12 through 14 mentions King Jeroboam. The Ahaz bulla, and a bulla is a small seal that was placed upon writings, and this came to light in 1995. It dates to around 730 years before Jesus. And Ahaz is mentioned in Isaiah 14:28. And actually may have the fingerprint of King Ahaz on the left side of it. Now, of great importance is, of course, King David in the history of Israel. And as has been mentioned, some people doubted his kingship and the extent of his kingdom. But recently, there have been discoveries just south of the old city of Jerusalem, which seem to indicate that David's palace has been found. Hezekiah's tunnel is near this, as well as the Pool of Siloam, and it is, as I mentioned, south of the old city. We're on the Mount of Olives looking westward into the old city of Jerusalem. To the south is where David's city was found and is being currently excavated. And we're looking also at where Solomon's temple would have been built, right across the valley. Elliot Mazar has been excavating this for several years. Began around 2005 when she discovered the monumental palatial structure, it's called, or the large stone structure, which dates, she assumes, to around 1000 BC, I should say. 51 different bulla inscriptions were found here. King Zedekiah's ministers, who plotted to kill Jeremiah, as found in Jeremiah chapter 37, their names are mentioned on these bulla. King Jehoiakim's scribe is also mentioned from Jeremiah 36 and verse 10. And the text from the jar handle is the oldest script found in Jerusalem. To this point, we've looked at a lot of the relics and artifacts from Israel that have parallels and support the authenticity of the Bible. We want to look now at some of the cities in Israel and their history and the remains and ruins there. First of all, at Megiddo, we have some excellent ruins that have been excavated. Dating back to 2000 BC are some massive walls that were rebuilt in 1500 BC. The Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III defeated this city in 1468. And then it was rebuilt by either Solomon, Ahab, or Jeroboam, or perhaps three of these guys worked together in succession to make this quite a fortified city. In 945, though, again, an Egyptian pharaoh Shishak conquers this, mentioned in 1 Kings 14:25. This is the diagram of the city of Megiddo and some of the major sites that are found at this excavation. There's a temple there from some of the Canaanite religions. And there are two different locations for stables, the southern stables and the other northern stables. There's a water tunnel there that we'll descend into in a couple of minutes. And then there's the Casemite Gate and a Canaanite palace at Megiddo. Here's the altar at Megiddo from around the time of Joshua and the conquest. And then, as we mentioned, Pharaoh Necho defeated King Josiah of Judah here in 609 BC. 2 Chronicles mentions this. Necho, king of Egypt, came up to make war at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out to engage him. This same incident is mentioned in 1 Kings, and I did mention that the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser conquers Megiddo in 732. And again, in reference to what we just mentioned in 609, Egypt and Judah fight here, and King Josiah is killed. In 2 Kings 23 and verse 29, while Josiah was king, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the Euphrates River to the king of Assyria. King Josiah marched out to meet him in battle, but Necho faced him and killed him at Megiddo. As we look across the Jezreel Valley, we see Mount Tabor. This is one of the traditional sites of the Transfiguration of Jesus, but you see the large plain here. And because there were so many battles fought around Megiddo, in the book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible in the New Testament, this is probably the reason for the mention here of Megiddo and the place that we get of the great battle of Armageddon. It's located and has history in this area around Megiddo. As I mentioned, there are stables here at Megiddo. It became quite a fortress for either Solomon or Ahab, and perhaps Jeroboam, we're not sure which. But 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 26 through 29 mentions that Solomon had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen stationed in chariot cities. And this is perhaps one of them in the stables that are found at Megiddo. Here's a feeding trough around the stable with me looking on. And then there's the water tunnels, very interesting. Of course, many of these cities had to dig deep for water. Often they weren't located near rivers or water source. So this water tunnel is very interesting at Megiddo. You had to descend quite a distance down and then a tunnel and exit outside. There's another water tunnel at Hazor. north of Megiddo. And we want to go there next and look at its history just a little bit. Hazor is the last city under the ban, and it was burned as recorded in Joshua chapter 11, verses 10 through 11. A burned layer has been found here, probably the one that Joshua was responsible for. Evidence of this 13th century BC conquest was discovered by Yigal-Edin, who excavated here in 1955 and through 58 and again in 68 and 69. In 2010, a new piece of Akkadian law code was found from the 18th or 17th century BC. Interestingly, a large number, 19 cuneiform documents, were found. It's the largest find of documents from the cuneiform, or Egyptian language, here at Hazor. A look at the Hazor from the air and some of the excavations at Hazor. It was also a Canaanite worship center. Hazor is mentioned in the Moabite Tablets, which we've already looked at, and also in the Amarna letters. And a couple of the kings that are mentioned sound like, and etymologically may be similar to dynasty of Jabin, the king of Hazor, as mentioned in Joshua chapter 11 and verse 1. And in 2013, near the entrance to the Canaanite palace, an Egyptian Sphinx statue was found, the feet of it. The Egyptian king, Menkaure, who actually ruled in Egypt around 2500 BC, is named in the hieroglyphics found between the feet of this Sphinx. It is the first statue of this Egyptian king found anywhere in the world. He was actually the builder of the third and smallest pyramid at Giza. This Sphinx was found from the 13th century before Christ in its destruction layer, and possibly it was brought here from the Hyksos, who ruled Egypt in the 17th or 16th century BC. They may have brought it home as plunder from Egypt. In the record of the Israelite conquest of Israel, found in Joshua chapter 2 through 11, only 3 cities were burned: Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. And the last city that we want to look at briefly is the city of Jericho. After 5 different excavations by various people, at least several things are agreed upon, and there is much controversy about some of the finds. But the areas that are agreed upon is that there was a double stone wall which surrounds the city, which was topped with mud bricks. There was an upper and lower city. And the interesting thing is there were very large quantities of grain found in this city, even though the city had been destroyed. There was a burn layer also. As I mentioned, in the Bible, it's one of the 3 cities mentioned as being burned, and we did find a burn layer here at the appropriate location and time, and at Hazor, which we just looked at briefly. The city was destroyed by fire, and the walls did collapse. This is all agreed upon. As I mentioned, pots of grain were found, and they were filled, which shows that even though the city was destroyed, there was not a long siege, or the grain would have been eaten. Jericho, probably the name means moon city, and it may have been a center for pagan worship. It's probably the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, ruins going back to around 5,000 years before Christ. There are differences on dating, and this kind of illustrates how sometimes different people have different opinions on dating, and sometimes problems are created. But in 1930 through 1936, a man named John Garstang excavated Jericho. And he figured that the destruction of Jericho occurred around 1400 BC, which, as you might recall, was related to the early date of the Exodus of 1446. As you recall, the people of Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years because of the lack of belief. And so that means they would have invaded around 1400 years before Christ. And that's where this layer, John Garstang dated, actually is situated. However, in 1952 and excavating through 1958, Kathleen Kenyon estimated that this burn layer and this destruction took place around 1550, which 150 years before Joshua supposedly destroyed the city. Controversy developed, and then a man named Bryant Wood in 1990 excavates the city again. And he affirmed John Garstang's dating for the destruction of the city around 1400 BC. The reason he challenges Kenyon's datings are as follows. Kenyon dated her conclusion upon the date for the destruction on the absence of Cypriot bichrome pottery. As we've mentioned before, pottery is one way people date the different levels that they find. And there was no Cypriot bichrome pottery, therefore she says it must be earlier. Her conclusions, though, were from a very small area of the city. She only excavated two 26 by 26 foot squares. So to date and make a big deal out of the dating of such a small area of this city may not be warranted. She also failed to publish her finds and research. It was later done after her death by a man named T. Holland. A look at some of the walls that she excavated at Jericho and the diagram of those walls. In any case, there's a great parallel between the biblical account and the archaeological evidence in the destruction of Jericho. First of all, Jericho was a heavily fortified city. Double walls, and both in Scripture and archaeology find this to be true. The walls did collapse as recorded in Scripture and as found in the ruins. The destruction of Jericho was at the harvest time because much grain was stored then, and this goes along well with the Bible record. And the siege would have been short because the grain had not been eaten and was still there. And the grain was not plundered. As I mentioned, this was one of the cities placed under the ban. As a first fruit of the conquest, everything was to be given to God or not plundered by the Israelites. And so that's why the grain, in all likelihood, is still there. It wasn't plundered by the invading army. Otherwise, it would have been taken and eaten by the invading army. Very interesting. And then, of course, the city was burned. So in these three cities, we do see evidence of the Israelite invasion and Israelite inhabitation of these various localities. In this case of Jericho, it was not re-inhabited. And as I just mentioned, the city was abandoned for quite some time, and a curse upon whoever tried to rebuild it, as occurred later in Scripture, as it recorded. All these inscriptions show that yes, there was a lot of communication taking place, a lot of writing, a lot of recording of history. And so we have confirmation of many places and many people of Israel and those outside of Israel in Scripture. In the next session, we want to look at archaeology in the Old Testament as it relates to several nations surrounding them.